Hello and welcome to RGU Talk, the official podcast of Robert Gordon University. I'm your host, Johnny Milne, and it's a real pleasure to be joined by Professor of Librarianship. It's Professor Peter Reid. Peter, thank you for joining me today.
Hi, Johnny. My pleasure.
So, what exactly does your role at the university involve?
It's about as long as a piece of string. It's really difficult to say. It involves teaching, it involves research, it involves external activity with lots of organisations. I still think that the teaching is one of the really best bits about it. I thoroughly enjoy being in front of a class. My own areas are mostly connected with public library management, quality management, but also a lot of cultural heritage, local history related stuff. And it's a fascinating, really diverse role.
And am I right in thinking you've been teaching here at RGU for about 20 years now?
It's 20 years this month, in fact,
My
since
goodness.
I started. Yes.
Happy anniversary.
Thank you. I had hair and it wasn't grey then.
So what's it been like to see the university change and grow over the decades you've been here?
I think it's really interesting to see how the university has evolved, because when I first started, we'd only been a university for maybe 5 years at that point, and now we're coming up to 25 years as a university. So it's been very interesting. We've become so much more professional in a lot of the things that we do. We've grown. We've moved out to Garthdee. In fact, when I started, we just moved into the Aberdeen Business School building. So there was no health and social care, no Surrey and Wood building. So there's been huge changes in that. The other thing that's particularly, I suspect, impacted on me directly is the way that we've moved into distance learning. Because a large proportion of our own master's students in information library studies, for example, are distance learners, and we were, I think, one of the very first courses in the university to go into that. So in that respect, we've seen how rapidly and hugely technology has changed.
And what was it that brought you to teach at RGU in the first place, those 20 years ago?
It was entirely opportunistic. I was finishing my PhD, for which I'd been funded, in the summer of 1998, and I was thinking, well, what am I going to do next? I suppose I have to get a job and go out into the real world. And at exactly that point, there were some lecturing posts advertised, and I thought it would be stupid not to apply for this. And I was lucky enough to get one of them. I'm not sure at that point that I necessarily had a clear idea that I was going to follow an academic career. It was perhaps a case of needs must. But yeah, that was August 1998.
My goodness. One thing I did hear before arranging this chat was that a number of your former students have gone on to become colleagues of yours now. How does it feel seeing people you've mentored go on and succeed in their careers?
That's absolutely right. A number of my colleagues are people that I taught. I would think particularly of Dina Martsuku, who is within our school and who's gone on and done tremendous things from the point that she was doing the Masters, but also Lizzie Tate, who's just left us to go to a post in Melbourne in Australia. She was a student and then became a member of staff. And I have to say it's one of the greatest joys of the job. But it's also a great joy in watching the people who don't go into an academic career but go into the profession,
of course,
and watching them develop their career. And one of the things that I try to pride myself in doing, is to keep in touch with our former students. We have an alumni award within the courses, and it's always a great joy every year to see who has made the contribution that deserves that award. So I really enjoy watching people's careers and seeing them making a difference, not just to the profession, but I think ultimately to society.
No, it is really lovely. Well, I suppose in your 20 years at the university, one of your standout moments would be back in 2015 when you delivered a professorial lecture about the culture and heritage of the Northeast, and did it entirely in Doric.
I did indeed.
It was, what I understand, it was just before I joined the university, but it was one of the best attended lectures we've held at the university. What was that like?
Well, I do look back on that as, I suspect, one of the big highlights of the last 20 years. And I think it would be fair to say, if I'm honest, that I made an enormous rod for my own back. When I was approached about doing the professorial lecture, I rather blithely said, "Oh yes, and I'll do it in Doric." And of course, there was a year ahead. It was a year ahead before I would be doing it. So it was incredibly challenging to script it in Doric.
Yeah.
And I generally, when I'm teaching, don't have any notes. I just have cues from my PowerPoint slides. But for this, I felt it was really important to get every word right and to get every sentence and paragraph to mean exactly what I wanted it to. So I did script it. And writing what I think amounted to maybe the equivalent of 30 pages in Doric was challenging. Not least for Microsoft Word.
Red lines under everything.
Red lines under everything. And then at one point it did come up, there are too many spelling errors in this document. Word is shutting off spell check, which I've never had before or since. So it was very challenging. But the thing that I'm probably most passionate about is this region, the northeast corner, the sort of Montrose to Nairn area. It's where I'm from, it's where my roots are, it's where a lot of the university's work and relevance is felt. And I wanted to explore so many different aspects of the culture, the heritage, the history, and its relevance to contemporary society in the professorial talk. And I felt that one of the most important aspects of that culture and heritage was the Doric dialect. And therefore it was important to try and show that Doric is not just the language of the classroom or the supermarket, that I beg your pardon, the language of the playground and the supermarket, that it is in fact the language of the classroom, and academic discourse can be done in Doric. It was good fun. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Would I do it again? Probably I'd be enough of a sucker to say yes.
Well, I mean, I must admit, I was born and raised in Aberdeen, but sometimes, bizarrely, Doric is like a completely separate language for me. Was it, so when you were getting ready for the lecture, how important was it to you to speak like, I can't even do it myself, to speak
to
like...
speak proper.
Yes. How important was that to you in the planning process? And did you find there were people in the audience who maybe didn't understand everything you were saying? Yes,
and I know that ahead of it there were one or two people who were concerned that they wouldn't be able to jalouse what I was saying. But I did provide translations of words or phrases that even I felt were particularly complicated or difficult. And I had a bit of fun doing that because I didn't translate them literally. I translated them to make the audience have a chuckle, really.
Excellent.
So, for example, when I was speaking about the oil industry, I translated that as black stuff that comes out of the sea. So there was a bit of tongue in cheek. One of the difficulties with doing anything in the Doric dialect is that there is no consistent spelling to it, and there are very subtle differences in the way that words are pronounced. A common one, for example, is it's a recht chav, meaning it's a great chore. And that's the way that it would be pronounced probably in most of Aberdeenshire, but in my own area of Banffshire, we would say kiav rather than chav.
Okay.
So right at the outset, I said there'll be words that some people will disagree with how I've used them or how I've pronounced them, but I'm reflecting the little bit of Banffshire that I come from and how it's said there. So it was good fun, and I think it was important to do. And I think maybe the number of people that came along sort of testified to the fact that there is an appetite to see the dialect more visibly in public life.
And picking up on that, obviously the Scottish Government has put such an emphasis on recognising Gaelic across all of Scotland, even up here where it's perhaps has always been less prevalent compared to Doric. Do you think there should be more done, and what more can be done by places like the Scottish Government to recognise Doric?
I think the Scottish Government does recognise very strongly the Scots language, but I think the Scots language community in general, and particularly the Doric community, which I'm more interested in, I must confess, can learn a huge amount from the way that the Gaelic communities in Scotland have mobilised themselves, have got themselves into groups and organisations and really promoted the language and promoted it in education and other spheres. So I think we're perhaps with Scots and certainly with Doric playing catch-up, but I don't think it's an either-or. I don't think it's a battle between one or the other.
No,
I think
of course,
both can learn from each other, and there's tremendous goodwill in the Gaelic communities towards the Scots language as well. So I think we can learn from them. I think the establishment earlier this year of the North East Scots Language Board, which is about trying to promote Doric in the public sphere, is a really important development. I think what we do desperately need is a bit more on the telly and the wireless.
Okay.
We want a bit more of the Scots tongue to be heard in that. Scots Radio does a fantastic job, but some stuff in mainstream media is important. So I think there's a lot of things. Aberdeenshire Council are doing fantastic work in schools. I was up, I think it was last year, up in Inverallie, where the kids have basically a Doric festival week in June each year, and that was a joy. And there's other fantastic teachers across the region. I think of folk like Jamie Fairbairn at Banff Academy, who does phenomenal work in being a champion for the dialect and the vernacular in education. So it's a combination of things, but we can definitely learn from what our Gaelic cousins have done.
And you mentioned earlier that when you were doing your professorial lecture, you had translations for particularly difficult words. Are there any that you can, aside from the IEL industry, as you said, is there any that spring to mind as particularly tough words even for you?
Well, there's some words that I find quite tricky, and there were some words that I used a bit tongue-in-cheek. Nap darlichs is a really good Doric word to get into any talk, and I thought, how do I explain nap darlichs in a really polite fashion to a genteel audience, because it's effectively excrement that attaches itself to farmyard animals.
Got you.
So it's a good word. It's a handy word in conversation.
Of course.
But yeah, there were one or two. That was the one that stood out, and it raised quite a chuckle.
Well, what is it about local history and heritage that interests you so much?
I think it's twofold. On the one hand, a lot of what I do in the northeast region, in Aberdeen, City, Shire, Banffshire, Moray, it's in some way it's something that I feel a visceral connection to because I'm part of this community. And I think increasingly there's recognition in government and in funding bodies like the Heritage Lottery Fund and so on of the value of promoting the cultural and heritage identity of places. And certainly one of the projects I was involved in over the last few years, called Castle to Cathedral to Kashmir up in Elgin, was very much about driving economic regeneration and town centre regeneration by using heritage to tell the story of the town better for visitors. Okay. That's one side. The other side is the way it actually makes people feel. Engagement with their own past and their own community, and feeling that matters every bit as big history does, you know, wars and kings and queens. You know, what happened in your own village or in your own town, or the people in your family that went to the Great War and didn't come back. That's every bit as important. I've been doing quite a lot of work with Buckie Fishing Heritage over the years, and I had a great student a couple of years ago worked with them, and in that particular project where she was looking at how people reacted to old photos of the community, you really saw that strong visceral connection that they had, which I suppose is the other side of what I was saying a second ago about my own visceral attachment to it.
Yeah.
I think knowing the place that you come from, or that your family have roots to, and telling the often forgotten and underlooked stories of places, that's really what drives me.
And slightly away from local history and culture, I understand you're involved in a number of other projects, but one in particular about connecting with artists across Scandinavia. What can you tell us particularly about that, but about the other things you've got on your plate?
Yeah. That one's really interesting because it does have a very strong local dimension to it, even though it's linking to Iceland, Norway, Denmark, and other parts of the UK, and it's basically a project to connect artists and archives, and this is something that I've done actually with an organisation that I work with outside the university, but there's clear benefits for RGU in it, not least because we've managed to secure a European Year of Cultural Heritage Artist Residency, and in fact our resident artist will be resident from Tuesday of next week, so I'm looking forward to that. And this is to tell hidden or neglected or forgotten stories that link the communities around the North Sea and the North Atlantic. So there are partners in, as I say, Iceland, Norway, Denmark, England and Scotland, and we're looking at all of the refugees from Norway and Denmark that came over to the northeast of Scotland during the Second World War. And the artist we've got is a musician, and he's Norwegian but lives in Denmark. So given that the vast majority of the refugees were Danes or Norwegians, it's a perfect fit for us.
Yes.
Yeah. And I'm also doing work with a number of other groups, particularly interested in what's happening with the Cabrick Trust, which is looking at the regeneration of the area between Dufftown and Huntly, and plans to put in a micro distillery and a visitor centre. And that's just a classic model, beautiful example of using heritage to aid the regeneration of a community. And I've put a proposal into one of the funding councils to look at particular aspects around that community and the Great War this time. So touch wood, fingers crossed, that will maybe go somewhere.
Well, it'd be fantastic to get you back on to learn more about those if it does. But finally, before we end, I have to ask about your megastar cat that one of my colleagues was telling me about,
Mountbatten cat.
What can you tell me about Mountbatten?
Well, Mountbatten cat is a celebrity in his own paw print. He's a little monkey. He often appears on my lecture slides.
Okay.
He has his own Facebook page, which I have to say a bewildering number of former students follow.
I can imagine.
And they all buy into the Mountbatten cat story,
Okay.
which is basically his constant battle to get one up on me. And he's a pure white cat. He was a rescue cat that I got 4 years ago, and for the first 2 months he was incredibly badly behaved.
Okay.
And he was called Toffee, which is a really stupid name for a pure white cat.
Well, yes.
Yeah.
I can understand.
And I was thinking, I really need to rename this cat. And after 4 months of having been bitten and turning his nose up at food and being really selfish and bad-tempered and grumpy and all the rest of it, my eye fell on the biography of Lord Mountbatten, who was all of those things,
Indeed.
in my bookcase. And I thought, Mountbatten, that's the perfect name for the cat. So, yeah, you can see him at facebook.com/MountbattenCat.
And thus the legend was born.
Indeed.
Well, Peter, thank you so much for joining me today. That's been fascinating.
My pleasure. Arthur Fine.
I was going to come up with one myself, but I can't think of one. I'll come up with one maybe in post-production, edit it in. Well, that's it for another episode of RGU Talk. On behalf of the university, I have been Johnny Milne, and we'll talk to you later.